Okay, in this series of lectures, we're addressing multiple ways that we can calculate a predetermined overhead allocation rate in order to allocate manufacturing overhead to our products as they are moving through the production phase. So we've talked about the single plant-wide rate, which simply identifies one estimated overhead cost pool and one estimated overhead cost driver to determine a predetermined overhead allocation rate for our entire manufacturing process. Then we looked at using multiple rates, and we could use 2, 3, 4. Okay, the process can go on, but different rates for different departments. And we saw how the more cost pools we can identify and the more accurate drivers that we can identify, the more accurate our allocation of manufacturing overhead cost become. And this is crucial to being able to identify the total cost of my product. All right, so the third one we're going to look at is called activity-based costing. And this is a little easier to do, even though it is a complex topic. It's a little easier to do in today's environment and manufacturing setting because of the advanced technology that we can have. And so activity-based costing looks at the different cost activities that are taking place in order to allocate the manufacturing overhead. So this could be 2 activities or 20 activities. So we have to think about what is truly how cost beneficial is it to truly track more than one estimated manufacturing overhead pool and more than one cost driver. And that's what we're going to look at in these cost activities. What activities are taking place? What's driving them? And activity-based management is simply the phrase that is used when we say that we're using activity-based management if our organization actually does utilize activity-based costing to determine the cost of their products. Okay, so let's look at some examples. What do we mean by identifying activities? Well, for example, if you're in the manufacturing process, and I know that most of you have never been inside a manufacturing plant and you may have never seen a manufacturing process, but there are some things that take place. So for example, there's quality inspections. So if your organization, whether you're receiving the materials or delivering the materials, you may have an inspection process that is required by the ISO standards to be sure that the materials that you are shipping or that you are moving into production meet a certain quality standard. And so we have cost in these quality inspections. And if we were trying to allocate the cost of our quality department, then maybe the number of inspections is what is driving the cost in the quality department. What about warranty services? Okay, so if we're trying to identify the cost of our product and warranties are a part of it, then how do we warranty services are a part of it, then how do I allocate the cost of my warranty services? Well, maybe it's based on the number of service calls that I receive. Okay, so you can see the relationships taking place here. So maybe in shipping, how can we allocate the cost in our shipping department? Maybe it's based on the number of pounds that my shipping department actually moved this period. Setup. This was a new phrase to me when I moved into manufacturing. Setup simply means if you have several machines that are generating different products, then every time I have to shift the programming of that machine from one setting to another, or dismantle parts of that machine and add other parts of the machine to manufacture a different product, this is called setup. So it takes time to stop the process that is being manufactured, reprogram the machine, make any additions that we need, and then begin manufacturing a different product on the same machine. This is called setup. And setup costs are very expensive for an organization, so we like to run as many parts on that machine as we possibly can before we have to break it down and build it back up to manufacture a different part. Okay, so if we're trying to analyze the cost in the setup department, maybe it's simply the number of batches that we ran through. or the number of setups that took place in that organization. We have a machining department maybe that's generating tools for our organization. We might look at the number of machine hours. Purchasing, purchasing raw materials is part of the cost of manufacturing my product. Maybe I need to look at the number of purchase orders. So we're basically saying, look at your organization's manufacturing process. Identify the different activities that are taking place, from quality to warranty to shipping to setup. And we have, if there are significant indirect cost or manufacturing overhead in these departments, estimate what that manufacturing overhead is and estimate what those drivers are. And using those estimates, we can see an example of activity-based costing in this situation. So the text has chosen 3 different areas: setup, production, and testing. Okay, so they have looked at their, and how do we get here? We look at our estimated overhead cost, or we look at the overhead costs that we have spent in the past. And if I can look at those costs, can I break them down into significant cost pools or categories? And so here your text has said, yes, we spend about $15,000 in overhead for setup, $65,000 for production, and $20,000 in testing. So if we've decided that the number of batches are driving setup, direct labor hours are driving production, and the number of tests are driving testing, then I go back and estimate, well, how many batches do I think I'm going to run for my standard product? How many batches for premium? How many direct labor hours have I estimated for standard and premium? And how many tests do I anticipate for standard and premium? So we come up, so now we have our, I'm going to call this estimated overhead. Okay, my crazy writing. This is my estimated overhead. And now I have come up with my estimated, and I'm going to call this CD, because that's what we call it in the field, our estimated cost driver, or you can call it your estimated allocation base if you want. That's what the text uses. So now that I have those, my estimated overhead, my estimated driver, I can estimate my allocation rate. It is $250. So for every batch, every time I have to set up the machine again for a new batch, it costs me $250 in overhead. On production, we're estimating that for every direct labor hour, not cost, but hour that I incur, I'm spending $5.20 in overhead. And for every test that I run on my product, I am incurring $2 of overhead for those tests. Okay, so once we know those allocation rates, $250, $520, $2. Now I can allocate overhead to my setup department for the standard, allocate it overhead to the premium. It's simply the number of batches, the number of batches, 40 times my overhead rate. 20 batches times my overhead rate. So not only am I breaking it down, not only am I being more precise in my overhead allocation rate, but I'm able to allocate it to my standard and to my premium products. And we're going to do the same thing in production. I can allocate this $65,000 to my standard products and to my premium products. Okay, so the same thing happens in testing. So we can see a pictorial example of this. Let's go back and look at our ABC cost system, which we just did. Here's our manufacturing overhead, our estimated manufacturing overhead. And we've been able to break that down into 3 different categories: setup, production, and testing. Now, realize there could have been 5 other activities that were driving this manufacturing overhead in my organization. But is it really cost efficient to track manufacturing overhead for 5 more departments? Or can I allocate this overhead to the departments that seem to be the primary drivers of my overhead? And they have identified, yes, let's stick with these 3. It is only cost beneficial for us to track the cost from these three different activities. And this is why I mentioned it's easier for us to do this the more automated a company is and the more highly sophisticated technology that they have, then they can track these costs and these drivers easier. And so once again, we simply allocated setup based on a number of batches, production based on labor hours, and testing based on the number of tests to both of my models. Whereas when we did this simply for one allocation base and not three, we're simply using direct labor cost and to move those costs into the standard versus the premium models. And although this is effective and it does work, it's not as accurate as using the ABC cost system. But once again, you have to decide in your organization what is cost beneficial to you and how cost beneficial is it to track one activity versus 5 versus 10. Okay, there has to be some common sense and critical thinking to take place here. All right, take a break. We'll come back and look at Objective 2 and why companies actually decentralize.